Again, everybody please get back towards your seats so we can get going. Again, this is session 8, Host Railroad Collaboration. Our moderator here is Mr. Barry Green. Barry is a representative for the Rail Passengers Association for what area? Montana and North Dakota, right, Barry?
I'm council rep for Montana, but I represent the members in North Dakota and Idaho because they don't have council reps.
Okay, and fun fact, Barry is a fellow Glendivian. He and I live in the same town in eastern Montana together in Glendive, Montana. So he helped me at our county fair a few weeks back, manning our BSPRA booth. So thank you, Barry, for coming up and moderating this session. And then joining us as panelists in this session, we have Jim Tylick from BNSF, the VP of Passenger Operations. I got that right, Jim?
Sure.
Okay. And then, again, we have Deva Katila joining us again from Jacobs Engineering, Spencer Dodge from HDR, Bruce Agnew from Pinwer, Andrew Johnson with Columbia Strategic Consulting Group, and finally, Andy Garland with Montana Rail Link. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to you, Barry.
Okay. Thanks, Jason. Thanks, everybody, for coming to this important session here right before lunch. I kind of got lucky getting picked for this session because made up of a bunch of rails and engineering group. So I kind of fit into this because I'm retired 40 years with the BNSF Railway as a locomotive engineer. So I was kind of pleased to pick this one. The first panelist presentation that we'll have is from Jim Tylick. As Jason said, Assistant Vice President, Passenger Operations with the BNSF Railway in Fort Worth. Jim.
All right, good morning, everyone. Thank you. First off, I want to say thanks for the invitation to be here. Thanks for Big Sky Passenger Rail Authority and for Chairman Strohmeyer. I just want to start by saying it's really exciting with all the energy that's been in this room over the last day and a half on what rail can do, the rail renaissance, and what next steps look like for our industry. So I've got a couple slides if we want to tee up the slides. So I recognize that this is a passenger summit, as stated behind me, but I think it's important as those passenger trains are operating on freight railroads to provide some context on what we do on BNSF. So just a broad overview, we've got 32,000 route miles across our network. We operate in 28 states as well as Canada. We serve 40 ports. We have 26 intermodal facilities, and we're owned by Berkshire Hathaway. There's currently 7 Class 1 railroads in the U.S. I'm proud to report at BNSF, as measured by volume or units handled, BNSF is the largest Class 1 railroad in America. We've got 35,000 employees, 8,000 locomotives. We operate at over 1,000 trains per day, focused squarely on safely moving freight from where it is to where it needs to go. When we think about what we provide, the economy, for our customers, there's really 3 C's: capacity, cost, and carbon. Capacity, we already heard earlier, 280 units or containers on a single truck. You can imagine how that unlocks capacity for our freight customers and become a vital link in their supply chains. On the carload side, fun fact, we handle enough lumber to build 500,000 houses in a single year across BNSF. On the cost side, from a competitive advantage, you can move obviously much more effectively based on the amount of units you can haul on a single train, so we can be a cost advantage to our customers. And then on the carbon side, and as the previous panel mentioned, rail provides a very environmentally friendly solution for our customers. We can move 1 ton of freight 500 miles on a single gallon of diesel. So that gives you an order of magnitude on what freight rail can provide. On the intermodal space, we've moved 5 million intermodal units last year. Those intermodal units have handled anything from electronics to furniture to food. So we really do see ourselves as a vital partner in the supply chain space. So this is a really cool slide. You know, we've been railroading for 170 years, but I like to say we're just getting started. At BNSF, we have a bias for growth. We want to be able to say yes to our customers and be easy to work with our customers. And this gives you two graphics on how we've had that bias for growth. So the chart on the left is showing our Southern Transcon, that's between Chicago and LA, and the amount of single track miles that were on the Southern Transcon over the years. And you can see, based on our commitment to invest in our network and for expansion, we've continued to whittle that single track segments down to nearly nothing. What's not shown on this map is the amount of segments that now have 3 main tracks, specifically in locations where there's grade, or 4 main tracks where there's locations where we're stopping to change crews, all in the interest of providing solutions for our customers to get across the country. And then the merger between BN and Santa Fe happened in 1995. This chart on the right shows index based on that base year, how we've grown at BNSF on that orange line over the years since merger. So we'll talk a little about passenger. This is an overview of our passenger operations. Not only is BNSF the largest freight railroad by volume from a Class 1 perspective, we actually are the largest host railroad from an Amtrak train miles hosted across the network, over 5 million miles. We very much appreciate our partnership with Amtrak as well as our other passenger agency partners across the country. On the commuter rail side, we play important part in Chicago, Minneapolis, Seattle, and LA. 3 of 4 of those commuter operations are actually operated by BNSF crews. Our mission in passenger is really the same on freight, right? How do we make sure that we deliver trains and passengers safely and efficiently each and every day from where they are to where they need to go? So I wanted to transition to talk a little bit about current state. It's been well documented in the media on some of the supply chain challenges and challenges across the rail network. Candidly, we are not satisfied with the service we're providing to our freight customers, nor our passengers as well as Amtrak. So really the driver there is multifolded. You've heard many components around the supply chain challenges and the various inputs that have constrained the network. The labor market is specifically challenged for us. We are actively hiring and trying to accelerate that pipeline for new employees in. As an example, we just stood up a new training facility in Norman, Oklahoma to accelerate new hires such that they're on the rails, as well as other tactical levers that we're pulling, things like voluntary temp transfers, where we're taking employees where we may have a spot surplus, we can move them temporarily to a location that has a deficit. We're deploying additional locomotives. And then specifically on the passenger space, we have various continuous improvement initiatives with various disciplines across BNSF to work on specific train groups that may be underperforming from an on-time performance standpoint. So as far as expansion goes, expansion and enhancement and new service for BNSF is what that looks like specific to Amtrak and other commuter outfits. You know, I think it really boils down to 3 things: transparency, collaboration, and facts. So on the transparency side, early on in the process, it's important that BNSF communicate, as well as the other stakeholders communicate, as to what's required. At BNSF, we have passenger principles that have been longstanding for a number of years, and basically it boils down to we need to make sure that we can continue to provide the quality freight services today and into the future with the introduction of passenger rail. So that's important, as well as the liability and indemnification standpoint. On the collaboration side, I've heard it said many times yesterday, having a seat at the table is important, and that cannot be said enough. And it was actually mentioned in the previous panel of engaging the railroads. You know, when you look at expansion and looking at additional passenger service across a specific network, it's important to have a collaborative discussion and engagement early on such that you can come up with solutions that work for all parties. And then lastly, on the fact side, right? I mentioned in the breakout room earlier today, I think anyone in the transportation industry, whether it be freight rail, passenger rail, the airlines, Greyhound buses, we track everything, right? We love data. So in that spirit, as we continue, when we explore intercity passenger service expansion, we need to make sure that we follow the facts. We need to make sure that we have the inputs right for the modeling side, and we need to make sure that we test to see what infrastructure may be required or what operational changes may be required as it relates to those modeling exercises. So when we do all that right, we can find mutually beneficial solutions for freight and for passenger. And as I mentioned earlier, we're just getting started on the rail industry. So all we've got a very, very bright future as it relates to rail.
Thanks, Jim. We'll turn our continuing discussion over to our next panelist, Andy Garland. Andy's Director of Communications with Montana Rail Link out of Missoula. Andy?
Thanks, Barry. First off, I'd just like to reiterate what Jim had touched on and just say thank you for allowing us to participate and for all the work that's gone into this. Really appreciate having a seat at the table. As Barry said, I'm the Director of Communications for Montana Rail Link. We're across Montana's southern line there. This map kind of outlines it. So our system starts at Jones Junction just east of Huntley and runs west to Sandpoint. We've got over 937 miles of track there. Our four main terminals are based out of Laurel, Livingston, Helena, and Missoula as you work east to west. Laurel and Missoula are kind of our big crossover transportation hubs, and then Livingston and Helena serve as our helper districts as we've got some pretty major mountain grade at that point in our system. We've got 15 section houses spread out across the system as well, where our local MOW teams are stationed each day doing kind of maintenance work, and then obviously when we have issues arise, they're boots on the ground right there. Again, to kind of touch on what Jim had said, safety is our number one priority. It starts with our daily job briefings. It starts when we're looking to hire new folks. That's something that's touched heavily in the interview process on whether or not they're going to be able to kind of adapt and fold into our safety culture and help improve it. As you can see from the little graphic there, our reportable accidents have decreased heavily over the course of the last 20 to 25 years. That's something that the organization has worked tirelessly on and takes a tremendous amount of pride in. We've got a lot of great folks and a great training rules and safety department that a lot of that credit goes to. Just some kind of figures on the side there. We run rail detector and geometry cars, 2 to 5 times a year. We've got 29 wayside detectors. We've got 12 assistant roadmasters across the territory, right? They typically oversee 2 to 3 of our sections and have their beat, and then we've got a roadmaster over the top of them. They're on call. Obviously, these last couple weeks, it's been busy for those folks doing heat patrol, doing a lot of that. And then we typically have somewhere around 245 track department employees, boots on the ground every day. We've invested a lot in our infrastructure and our people over the course of the last 5 years, $250 million roughly. A lot of that has gone specifically into infrastructure pieces, bridges, maintenance projects, a lot of state-of-the-art equipment. We've got a great work equipment outfit that keeps our folks up and running and productive. And then we're installing PTC across our system as well with an anticipated completion date of 2025. Capital and tie gang is a busy season for us. It typically runs end of March through around Thanksgiving. Last year's capital program included roughly 142,000 ties being replaced and 265 miles of track. And then this is just a quick traffic. As of a couple days ago, year-to-date traffic's roughly 18.4 trains per day. The pie chart obviously shows you what's being moved. Over 62,000 carloads of Montana goods moved, and we serve over 150 local Montana customers of various industries. And then Lastly, it's been highly publicized, but in January of this year, it was announced that the long-term lease agreement between MRL and BNSF will be terminated pending the regulatory approval through the STB. Current state of that is we're negotiating with our labor unions and preparing to file with the Surface Transportation Board. Until all of that is finalized, we continue to operate completely independently in the same fashion as we have since inception in 1987. So, thanks again.
Thanks, Andy. I'd like to acknowledge the next panelist on the list there. That's Deva Catala. She was a previous panel and will be on another panel. She's National Class 1 Rail Vice President with Jacobs Engineering Group out of Fort Worth, and she will be part of the Q&A session. She doesn't have a particular presentation here. Our next presentation will be kind of a joint presentation. The next gentleman is Bruce Agnew. Bruce Agnew is director of the newly created PENWARE, or Pacific Northwest Economic Regional Infrastructure Accelerator Program in Seattle, Washington. And this group is supported by the Columbia Strategic Consulting Group that Andrew Johnson, our other panelist next to him, heads up. Andrew is one of the founding partners of this and CEO of Columbia Strategic Consulting Group in Fort Worth. Gentlemen?
Well, thanks. I just wanted, Andrew and I are going to do a joint presentation. I'm going to give the bulk of the conversation over to him. I just wanted to reiterate the Pacific Northwest Economic Region's invitation to you all to join us in Boise. I don't have the exact dates in July of next year to do a joint session and bring in some of the host railroads and agriculture and mining folks that we've been talking about. Also, there's been reference in the conference from Dave and others, and Thomas was on my panel from Alberta Regional Rail about the importance from learning lessons from our neighbors to the north. And PENWARE encompasses, besides going from the Arctic Circle in Alaska down to southeast Montana, it encompasses actually 6 jurisdictions in Western Canada: Saskatchewan, Alberta, British Columbia, Northwest Territories, Yukon, and the First Nations. And the First Nations are a very key part of our partnership. They're called tribal governments in the US. They're called First Nations in Canada, which I think has actually a nicer ring to it. But there are some interesting things going on in Canada with regard to passenger and freight rail. The Asia-Pacific Gateway Corridor, an initiative, I won't go into a lot of details because we'll talk about it next year, but that was a very interesting partnership from Manitoba to Prince Rupert and Vancouver, and it's a collaboration with the host railroads. In that case, it was Canadian National, Canadian Pacific, and BNSF. Vancouver, BC is the only West Coast railroad or port that has 3 railroads. And they have a problem similar to what we have in the Seattle-Tacoma area and Portland to some degree. And Ron Pate and I discussed this. The ports are nervous about more passenger trains interfering with freight and containers coming to their ports. You all heard about the supply chain crisis. It's real, and it's really congested in the Seattle-Tacoma area. Vancouver and the Asia-Pacific Gateway, Transport Canada, the railroads, the shippers, the terminals, the longshore unions, others all got together and invested $5 billion in their gateway to ease the safety and the congestion problems. They built in 4 years 22 highway overpasses over the rail corridors. If you've ever been to Vancouver, BC, you know they've got the Salish Sea and the Fraser River, and it's like Seattle. It's very congested. And they did it in an expedited way, and it shows the collaboration between freight and host railroads and shippers in terms of eliminating the conflicts with long oil and unit trains, gas trains, coal trains going through Vancouver to these terminals. So I think that's a great example of collaboration. Also, up north, we're working with Alberta, the First Nations, and Alaska on looking at rail connections between Alberta to the ports in Alaska and connections to the Alaska Railroad. These are all conceptual, but they're real. And then finally, a company that I admire a lot. It's called Rocky Mountaineer. It's probably the premier tourist trade operation in North America. They started operating from Vancouver to Banff and Jasper on the old CP and CN lines. Frankly, Via Rail in Canada has been neglectful of anything west of Ontario. So Rocky Mountaineer saw a business opportunity for high-end train that overnights in Kamloops. They've also developed relationships with BNSF because before the pandemic, they were operating a connector train from Seattle to Vancouver to connect to their service to Banff. They worked out a relationship, and now they're operating from Denver to Moab, Utah, with an overnight in Glenwood Springs. So they worked out their relationship with Union Pacific. So it is possible that other railroads besides Amtrak can work with the Class I railroads to make it work. The second point I would make is, and Andrew's going to cover this, at Penwar, we want to study the economic and environmental benefits of investments in a robust rail system. So we're going to be doing studies, we're going to be looking at underground utilities, and we call this a high-performance rail system. And to make that work, we brought on Andrew and Daryl, who came from BNSF. Andrew is Vice President of Community Affairs, worked with me in Congressman Miller's office. He was also transportation advisor to Governor Gary Locke. Daryl Ness was the just retired operations manager for BNSF, because we figured we had to figure out what the railroad needs in order to accommodate passenger service and deal with freight and ports. We intend to reach out to folks from Union Pacific, as well as the short haul rail lines, which are very important economic partners. Washington State has a very robust support program for our short haul rail lines, which are an important connector for agricultural products in the interior to the main line railroads. So I'll turn it over to you, Andrew.
Great. Thanks, Bruce. So as Bruce mentioned, Daryl Ness is another key member of our team at the Columbia Group. Daryl was the most recently, after a 40-year career at BNSF, part of the diaspora of former BNSF railroaders. It's a huge population of folks. Daryl taught me the railroad when I joined the railroad, and he was a general manager, so the top operating officer for that division, also the Southwest Division. And Daryl and I were tapped to support Bruce and Penwar, as is noted, with this new regional infrastructure accelerator. And that is a kind of a mouthful, but it's one of 5 designations, such designations across the country that USDOT selected. So the Penwar RIA, if you will, has a footprint that encompasses the Pacific Northwest, as noted. We've focused in on a couple of projects to start with. One of those is Pines Road. And I'm going to go to the next slide, and I'm not going to spend much time on it except to say that this is an example of a grade separation. It's been on the books for 2 decades and hasn't really gotten a lot of momentum. It's part of the corridor on the BNSF, northern corridor in the Spokane Valley. It's a great project and one of several that have been really championed to try to grade separate the BNSF main line. When we came on the scene, they had just put forth a Chrissy grant and were not successful. They invited us to review their application and provide some technical support and take a look at, what is the current count of trains per day and what is the dynamic of those trains moving through that crossing. We helped them with that process and answered some questions and worked through a number of issues. They put forth another application, and they have just been awarded a raise grant for, and I said Chrissy earlier, it was a raise grant, but they just received a raise grant for $22 million, a bulk of what's needed to fund that project, which is a great opportunity for that project now to move forward. Why am I mentioning this? Because grade separations, though they may not be quite as exciting to the railroad as they are to the communities that the railroad serves, they are hugely important. And you all know, if you benefit from a grade separation that used to be an at-grade crossing, what I'm talking about, right? They benefit society, they benefit the portions of the community that are separated, and as a liberated, retired railroader, I get to use all kinds of language that I would have never used as a railroader. So for those in the audience that are railroaders, you're gonna bristle a little bit, but it's okay. I know you're thinking this. Anyway, it really liberates, it really reconnects these communities that are divided by an at-grade crossing when the train is occupying the crossing. And sometimes that feels to the community like they're being held hostage while that train is operating the crossing. Emergency vehicles, we all know that story. So, does that mean that when you grade separate and eliminate that at-grade crossing, that suddenly frees up and provides additional capacity for the railroad? On the surface, it does not. I don't want to portray that. It doesn't necessarily mean the railroad gets to increase speeds. It does improve safety, there's no question about that, and all the other benefits. Maybe a railroad customer can actually get their product to market faster because of the grade separation, especially in important industrial areas. So they're hugely important. What they do provide is an opportunity for not just one-off cooperation with the Class 1 railroad, but if you think of it as a program of support, that's how you're going to build a relationship. These are the 2 points I really want to make. Grade separation's a valuable part of the role that you all can play as advocates, seeking passenger service, working with your communities in a layered, multi-jurisdictional kind of coalition, and it benefits the broader context of rail, passenger, and again, the communities that they serve, because you're getting closer to not a sealed corridor, but sections where, especially in condensed areas, where you could actually accomplish grade separations that bring you closer to what we call a sealed corridor, where you don't have a lot of at-grade crossings. So you're eliminating the potential, certainly train horn noise, but also the potential for incidences. So the other point I just want to make quickly, and I'm gonna do what you're never supposed to do. I'm gonna hold to my crib sheet because I think that'll enable me to get through it faster. But I wanted to come up with a list of, Jim mentioned the passenger principles that BNSF has. Brilliant document, one that all the other Class 1s leaned forward and said, hey, that's pretty smart. Wish we had something like that. And I think a lot of the other railroads have copied what BNSF has done in creating a passenger principle, or set of passenger principles. But if you go beyond that, I'm going to offer some perspectives that are really the opportunity to have a better, more honest interaction and relationship between community, between passenger rail advocates, and that host railroad. You got to understand what makes them tick. What are their driving forces? They are private entities, right? They are riveted on return on invested capital. They're, here I'm checking my crib sheet here. But decision-making can be slow and deliberative and conservative and wrapped up in legal protections that are very difficult for especially public entities that are first engaging now with a railroad in this context. It's very difficult for them to understand and appreciate. I would say also that as a member of the private industry, they're in competition. They're not going to do anything in terms of a partnership or enter into an agreement that challenges or provides some sort of potential benefit for their competitor, whether it's another railroad or perhaps a modal competitor, the trucking industry, what have you. So keep those things in mind. If you're moving freight by rail, David talked about this, other panelists have talked about the social benefits, the policy benefits that come by moving freight or moving product by rail, and you're seeking with passenger service, you're trying to accomplish a policy goal of moving more people, greater mobility. Well, remember, if you're actually trying to accomplish those policy goals of reducing congestion and increasing the efficiency of moving people and goods, freight railroad, it's awfully difficult to beat that. And for the points that have been made, haul 1 ton of freight, 500 miles, and 1 gallon of fuel, 280 trucks off the highway. In the Columbia River Gorge, you have a mainline track on the Washington side, that's BNSF, mainline track on the Oregon side, that's UP. They're both running 35 to 45 trains a day. If there was no rail, but you expected the same amount of freight to move through that corridor, you'd be asking an additional 10,000 trucks per day on each side of the river. It's so powerful, the policy goals that are achieved by freight rail. So please remember that. Now, that doesn't mean that passenger operations doesn't have a great role to play in helping further those goals, but I think they're really fundamental. And my parting shot is really to point out, let's see, as you can see there from coalitions and all the other parts of advocacy, the other thing is finding ways to build a partnership to fund projects. And one of the things that we are doing in supporting this Regional Infrastructure Accelerator is to focus on some federal innovative financing tools. And one of those is RIF, which is a railroad-related infrastructure loan program that frankly hasn't performed to its potential. It was reformed recently with a RIF Express focus, and it has turned some heads. And so we are hosting a webinar to really provide some perspective and input on RIF. So you have some information there at your tables. We can get you more information. And as Bruce rightly noted, so this RIF program was originally authorized in 1998. Over $30 billion. They've only issued $7 billion in loans, and most of that has gone to Amtrak. So obviously there's a bit of a challenge there, and Congress has recognized this, and so a lot of folks rolled up their sleeves and have brought forth some reforms that we're going to talk about in this RIF webinar. If you need more information, we can get it to you, but I think I better stop there and hand over the microphone. Thank you.
Thanks, Andrew. Our last panelist, Spencer Dodge, Strategic Project Manager for HDR Engineering. As you noted, his colleague Kat Dobbs was on the previous panel. Spencer, could you just give us a quick overview of your recent work in Colorado and then moving to Helena?
Thanks, Barry. I am, in fact, the real Spencer Dodge. Kat, thanks for stepping in. So prior to my position with HDR, I was down in Denver, Colorado, heading up and working with the Southwest Chief and Front Range Passenger Rail Commission. And that group had a kind of twofold mission. One was ensuring the continued service of the Southwest Chief line, and the other was implementing Front Range Passenger Rail, which is new service along the Front Range. And when I started with passenger rail, I was told, oh, you got to watch out for the railroads. You know, that's the big bad wolf. You can't work with them at all. And I thought, well, that's interesting. That's going to be a problem because trying to work on their infrastructure. And what I learned working with our friend DJ Mitchell and Jim Tylick is that you can, in fact, work with the Class I railroads. It's mentioned often this week, that you have to have early collaboration, early communication. You have to build trust with that relationship. At the end of the day, BNSF, MRL, Union Pacific, these are private companies. They do have their very specific interests, and so you've got to meet them where they are. And the only way to do that is to work with them early and often. On the Southwest Chief, there were a series of improvements that needed to be made to continue service. BNSF knew they've got their capital investment programs, they've got their plans, and so we really had to meet them halfway. And what we were able to do is kind of leverage that private interest in ensuring their infrastructure is up to date, and kind of also leveraging that public sentiment of keeping Southwest Chief service rolling. And so we were able to collaborate and bring in, 8 figures worth of federal grants. And so I believe we're once we get this last raise grant started, we're just about there as far as finishing up all of the infrastructure improvements. And so I'll keep this brief. It is incredibly important. We say this often. Collaboration as early and often as possible. You can work with the Class 1s from a state and a public side, but you do have to meet them where they are. They have their interests, we have ours, and they're often, surprisingly, not that different from each other. So I'll leave it there and we can turn it to Q&A, I think.
Okay, thanks, Spencer. Quick question, how many people in the audience might have a question for this group? Okay, that's fine. We'll get to you in just a minute. Okay, we'll start with some of these questions that I had, people. In recognition that a major component of this summit is the IIJA, what opportunities are there to find synergy between freight and passenger operations rather than seeing these as oppositional, particularly when it comes to contemplating reestablishing a long-distance national network route? Whoever would like to take that.
I'll take the first crack. So Spencer mentioned the Southwest Chief projects. Administrator Bose mentioned in his opening remarks. You got additional color from Mayor Rico yesterday. You know, this is an example where we were able to partner with local agencies, with Amtrak, to find win-win solutions. So between 3 Tiger grants, a RAISE grant, a Chrissy grant. The Chrissy grant specifically, we put in service PTC between Dodge City and Los Animas Junction earlier this year. That's 175 miles of PTC that was otherwise non-mandated based on the traffic profile on that subdivision. Now we're able to see the Southwest Chief, Amtrak 3, Amtrak 4, and a handful of freight trains that cross the Lahana Sub each and every day benefit from that infrastructure and that project. So I think, you know, that's a example where through early collaboration, through transparency, recognizing what both sides need, and exploring new opportunities and expanded service collaboratively will drive those beneficial outcomes to help leverage the IIJA opportunities.
Okay, thank you. Another question probably for Bruce Agnew and or Andrew. How easy or difficult might it be for advocacy groups and or stakeholders to work with similar groups and operators across the border in Canada? And is there a vast difference between the two countries politically that would impede this type of collaborative effort for expanding passenger rail services north of the border?
Well, yes, there are 2 incredibly different government structures. There's a parliamentary system in Canada, and they have multiple political parties, unlike the U.S. The provinces have more power. There's a Rail Relocation Act in Canada that allows the government to relocate rail lines, which we don't have here. I mentioned VIA. VIA is actually fairly pathetic west of Ontario. Unfortunately, they've gone to 3 times a week, and the level of service isn't really what it should be compared to our Amtrak, which is much more robust system. But there is, as Thomas indicated, there's a lot of interest in cross-border work. There's challenges, as we've discussed, with regard to you know, border crossings and inspections and vaccines, and Canada's pretty strict with their COVID rules. But there are opportunities, and I can't not mention a very important project I should have referenced yesterday, and I will be up at the Cascadia Corridor Conference in Blaine, September 13th. Washington State DOT, Oregon, the province of BC, Microsoft, and many business leaders have gotten behind high-speed rail study. And I don't know, Ron, I think it's like $4 million of state funds that have been used. They're applying and probably will receive a federal grant. This is a big deal. It's an entirely new right-of-way. Now, that doesn't come at the expense of the Amtrak Cascades, and Lord knows a lot of concern and speculation about acquiring real estate for a new right-of-way. But the economic benefit analysis and the data that it generates is very important. And it also is indicative of a remarkably positive relationship between the governors of Oregon and Washington and the Premier of British Columbia. And those have changed over the years I've been working on Amtrak advocacy. There's some opportunities in Alberta. I mentioned the Rocky Mountaineer. I think the Rocky Mountaineer is interesting opportunity. If you look at the Alaska Railroad, which you should all study because it's very interesting, it carries freight, it carries local people. They have something called the whistle stop, where you actually pull the lever and it stops and drops you off in the middle of nowhere, and you hike 5 miles to your settlement. It's only in Alaska. But and then from May to October, they attach these incredible dome cars that take you to Denali, and the price is much higher. It's part of the cruise ship package. But those are 3 revenue sources. And the discussion up in Alaska now is to upgrade the Alaska Railroad and move port operations from Anchorage to Seward, which is much closer to Seattle and Tacoma. So there's a lot of lessons to learn from Canada. I would hope, again, that when we have our next session that we have panels from Canada to talk about what they do. And they have, what's very interesting also is Canadian National and Canadian Pacific are purchasing rail lines in the US, in the Midwest. I think Kansas City, Southern, and so there's an integrated North American rail network. So we need to pay attention to that. We need to work with them, but we need to be mindful of different cultures and different governance structures.
Thanks, Bruce. We have a question from the audience.
Thank you. My question is, there's some lead in. I think all of us are here because we are interested in seeing more passenger rail, both short and long distance trains all over the country. However, it seems that with the planning horizon, having to cobble together different pots of money over years, then doing NEPA studies, then doing economic impact studies, engineering studies, different jurisdictions, different states, it can take years or decades to do this. And that's a very long planning horizon. There are many political changes during that time. However, even though railroads outside of Amtrak's Northeast Corridor and a few segments of VIA in Ontario and Quebec, freight railroads own the infrastructure. But it seems like they don't want to engage as much, even if they're consulted, until later in the process when there's actual money on the table. But then it takes decades and decades to obtain that money. Would private rail operators and freight owners be more willing to engage if there was an assured method of funding this that is known early in the process and then could actively do a lot of those engineering studies, those NEPA studies and environmental studies to compress the planning timeline and then actually getting new service implemented in an economic fashion?
So I'm going to take this one in part because I don't think it's fair to ask Jim to talk about the entire freight industry. He can talk about BNSF, but we were actually talking about this over breakfast, and I was joking that I feel like it's my mission almost from God to convince people that the freight railroads want you to talk to them early, and they are willing to engage. And that's not just BNSF. So I do this now. I used to do it just with BNSF, but now I do it all over the country. And every one of the freight railroads, a huge frustration they have is that people have this belief that they don't want anyone to approach them until they have a plan completed and ready to go. And that's just not true. They are very willing, and I'm sure Jim's going to back me up on this, but they are very willing to talk about this really early in the process. Now, a lot of times what they need to talk to you about is the fact that they don't have capacity. And we keep talking about, the tracks are there, why don't you just put some more trains on them? You do need to be concerned about capacity. And the one thing that the federal law does say is that if you're putting passenger rail on, you got to do something about the capacity. You can't ask them to stop moving freight in order to move more passenger. And so you need to have those conversations early because that gives you a better idea of what you need to plan and how much money it's going to cost to be able to put that capacity in.
Well said. No, I mean, I think from my perspective, the communication early is really important. And Spencer touched on our engagement with the Front Range Passenger Rail District now, our engagement with Big Sky Passenger Rail Authority. These are examples where we do want to have a seat at the table. We want to make sure that we have a collaborative discussion. Any new service is going to require modeling, that's going to require infrastructure. That level of infrastructure is going to be dependent upon many different factors, operating plans, train schedules, recovery, et cetera. So, you know, I think what we're talking about with IJA, with the long range or long distance study that the FRA is going to be embarking on, and stakeholder engagement, you know, these are all parts and pieces of how we're going to deliver a successful outcome and how we can try to make sure that timeline is as condensed as possible when we're looking at new services.
I would just add quickly that yes, the railroads, it is valuable and they are interested in you engaging with them early, but don't expect them to be able to read your mind. Don't expect them to be a party to necessarily all of your kind of corridor coalition building and unless they've already been participating in it. And my example for that is one that I think Bruce mentioned yesterday, the Fast Corridor Program, which if you're not familiar with Freight Action Strategy, hugely successful program in Washington State that was really designed to do mostly grade separations, but also other track geometry projects that really moved freight better, more efficiently into and out of port industrial areas. Hugely successful program. Railroads were not first at the table saying, oh yeah, we get this, we're ready, we're leaning forward. They had to be sort of convinced. And as that sort of ripened, the railroads did come on board and put money on the table that was able to be leveraged as partnership dollars for federal grant money. So it was big success. Matt Rose used to talk about, and at a conference in Montana a couple years ago, talked about the idea of expanding the fast corridor concept, turn it on its axis, maybe go east-west, whatever, but make it multi-state, a true coalition. And that is something that is a brilliant idea, but again, you can't expect the railroads to be the first one knocking at the door saying, let's do it. You have to do some coalition building.
Thanks, Andrew, and thank you, panelists, and thanks, everyone. Jason's going to come up here. Instructions again for lunch and guest speaker from Ukraine. Panelists, don't forget your gift bags as you're leaving the stage. Thank you.